Okay, today's table of knowledge.
P is for protection.
Okay, and that's not something sexual?
It's not condoms.
Now we thought we'd do a bit of a Q&A today on protection, because I have actually just spent last week, as I probably mentioned on the podcast, doing a course on, so I'm now actually going to be what's called a SEPEPA advisor, which is around succession, asset protection and estate planning. So I spent 3 days last week doing a very intense course on that. And it was just kind of timely that we're up to the letter P. I thought it was worth having a bit of a debrief on what I've talked about and what protection means.
Absolutely. So maybe we start from the very beginning. And when you're talking about protection, Jo, what actually is that? What is protection?
Yeah, so I'm probably mainly talking about asset protection today, but I'm also talking about protection of your general wealth. And so there's a whole lot of things that come into that as well. So not only do you want to make sure, particularly if you're a business person, that your assets are protected. If something happens in your business, you don't really want to lose everything that you've worked hard for. But also, if something was to happen to you, that your estate planning is done in a way that your assets tend to go to wherever you want them to go, not necessarily into someone else's hands. Now, I know if it is an estate planning matter, you're not going to be here to actually know what happens, but you would probably feel happier knowing that you've got a bit more in place around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the beginning there, Jo, you mentioned asset protection. So why is that important?
Okay, so I guess when we're talking to people about structures, and often this is around structuring your business correctly, not every business is successful. In fact, a lot of businesses fail. Some businesses can be very successful and then something can happen to them. Perfect example is that we're just talking about the subcontractors who are subcontracting to Porter Davis. They're probably now in a position which is not any fault of their own, where they're potentially going to have, to either liquidate their companies or go into some sort of insolvency matter to be able to get through, because they've paid out all this money. Now, if they've paid out money to their subcontractors under the subcontractor, so if we've got layers of that, then they've possibly had to borrow money to do that. Where did that money come from? Are they able to pay it back? If you have a significant loss in your business because of something, it can be. So asset protection is really about structuring things so that if something does go wrong, at least some of your assets are safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and probably the main one we talk about is the house. But of course, if you've had a successful business, you may have more than a house. You might have an investment property or a number of investment properties. You probably have some superannuation as well, which can be protected just purely by the nature of that it is superannuation. But, essentially, what assets do you have? If something goes wrong, who can get to them?
Yeah, so it's super, super important to keep those protected. And what are some strategies that people can use to keep their assets protected?
Okay, so it's an ever-evolving world out there. What we used to do in the first instance was we'd say, well, first of all, if you're married and if, let's say the wife, let's put me in context here. The wife is the business owner. She's the one with all the risk, and the husband may not have as much risk because of the nature of whatever they do for work. You would try and put whatever assets are risky assets, such as your house that you don't want to lose, into that person's name. That's a very basic strategy, and try and hold nothing in the name of the risky person, such as me. Now, that has worked in the past, but there's actually was a case fairly recently where they went, actually, no, we don't care about that. We don't care that the wife was the holder of the assets under some sort of insolvency issue. We believe that she was just holding it on behalf of the husband, and they actually came back and took her half of the house as well. So I used to always say, well, you might only lose half your house, but they actually lost the whole house in that circumstance. So what we try and do is find some way to separate the owner of the assets to the owner of the business, and that is usually via some sort of company structure as the very basic starting point. You don't want to be a sole trader or a partner in a partnership if you're in a risky business, because essentially there is nothing standing between your business and your assets. But if there's a company there, that's at least a method of protection. But we've got to the point now where there's all these sophisticated things we can do to try and hold assets in different ways such that they should be protected in the event of something going wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing you mentioned at the beginning there, Jo, was estate planning. So how does estate planning come into play with all of this too?
Yeah, okay. So it's funny because we've been talking about it in the office this week, because a lot of people don't have wills. And I mean, that's the very basic first step in estate planning. If you don't have a will and you lose capacity, it doesn't actually mean that you die. It could be that you've had some sort of mental issue that's made you lose capacity, such as dementia or a bad accident. If you don't have a will and you don't have anything that's called, like, there's a thing called an enduring power of attorney, which basically means that someone can act on your behalf while you're still alive, but you may not be in the capacity to act in that way. You can become what's known as a ward of the state, which means you can fall under the public trustees, and you don't want to do that.
No, you don't.
Okay, so you don't want someone in an office making a decision about you and your life and your assets. They're incredibly expensive, and we have seen, a few examples from here of people who are under that guardianship, and it is not somewhere where you'd want to be.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. So what you want to do is have some stuff in place before you get to that point. Now, if you're at a point where you do have dementia, it's too late. You have to make a will or to make an enduring power of attorney, you need to have that done while you're still very capable. So the best time to do it is right now. If you haven't got one, go do it. If I can please ask you to do that. Can I also suggest that you don't go and get a will done by the public trustee, because they will essentially make sure that they're your guardian, and that's what we want to avoid. So if you're getting a will done, you need to get someone to help you with that, be it a lawyer. I can actually now I don't write wills. I'm not the writer of the will, but I can facilitate that through a legal partnership that I have with proper lawyers who know what they're doing. So talk to someone and get that in place as soon as possible. I also suggest at the same time you do what we were just talking about, the enduring power of attorney, which gives you some protection as well. But the whole estate planning thing as well, you have to start thinking about what you want for your wealth going forward. Now, a lot of people go, yeah, I just want to give it to my wife or my children, which is, of course, probably what you want to do, but there are certain wills that you can write in such ways that are a little bit more complicated potentially than the, very basic, I want to leave my something to my something. They are a bit more complicated than that, but they actually can help you to keep the assets in your bloodline, which is, even if your marriage is perfect right now, you don't know what your children's marriage is going to be like, and you want to try and protect those assets as well as you can.
Yeah, definitely. And so I do know that one of those options is a testamentary trust.
Yep.
So do you want to talk about that a little bit, Jo, and explain how that works?
Yeah, so a testamentary trust is essentially a trust that forms on the death. So the testamentary means you've died. So a testamentary trust is something that you can get in place. It's part of your will. You have to mention it in your will that there is the ability to create that testamentary trust. And one of the things that was brought home to me, because I actually have a testamentary trust in my will, I do have to update my will, which is something I'm definitely going to be doing very, 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 very quickly.
We'll hold you accountable to that, Jo.
Shall be. Because, of course, one of my beneficiaries is my husband, who is no longer around. So I have to rewrite that will because my circumstances have changed. And that's another thing to be mindful of. If your circumstances have changed, potentially your will won't be valid anymore. So you need to go back and it's not something that you do when you're 20 and you leave it as that forever. It's something that you should be revisiting on a regular basis, and just making sure that what you want to have happen is right. Now, my will was written a little while ago. One of the things that when I got a testamentary trust written into my will was that the trust deed was actually in the will, but you don't have to do that now. You can actually just say that a trust can be created. And one of the problems with that is that if you have got the trust in the will, the laws may have changed a little bit, and it might mean that that trust doesn't have the same powers that a trust deed that is written today could have. So we've just got to be a little bit careful of that. Again, it's one of those things you should be reviewing regularly. But the advantage of a testamentary trust is that if you have that written into your will, particularly if you have minor children as beneficiaries, that inheritance can go into that trust. The trust can be managed by someone who is, obviously capable of managing it for them. There's a limit. There are powers in there as to what the children can use that money for until they're of age. So, in my testamentary trust, I had it written that my kids couldn't access that money until they were 25. In which case, unless it was for certain things. So they could get educated, they could do certain things, but they couldn't just have all that money because you don't want a 22-year-old to have lots of money and go out and
blow it up the wall.
Exactly. Or be vulnerable to people who go, hey, you're suddenly wealthy. I've got this great investment idea for you.
Yeah.
Right? So you want to have that little bit of, so they could still use it. We could still they're nearly, well, Joel is over 25 now. Jordan isn't, but they're, at an age where they're probably getting close to that. But, it just gives them that little bit of time for it to not get wasted. It also is good if you've got children who are vulnerable, in such ways that they may be either disabled, they may have addiction problems, they might, there's all sorts of things that can come into families. Every family is different. If the children are minor children, so under the age of 18, any income that's earned out of that testamentary trust that is for their, basically distributed to them, they're taxed as adults, which is something that you don't get to do very often. There's not many instances where children who are under the age of 18 can be taxed as adults, and taxing of children is at a very terrible rate. They get taxed at a high rate. So because they don't want you to put money into children's names, but this is a special reason that they have that. It's quite complicated, so I'm not going to try and go into it all here, but I would suggest particularly anyone who has any wealth about them that they should at least have written into their will something about a testamentary trust, because whether they've got children or not, because it could also benefit their grandchildren. It's definitely a very powerful thing to have in there.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's something that not many people would know about as well. So it's good to know that there are these strategies for wealth planning and things like that.
Yeah, and I think, look, back when these sort of started coming out, we'd go, oh, well, you wouldn't put that in there unless you were wealthy. But what is to have an extra line written into your will that might benefit people? I mean, if you've got a house, you're wealthy, I think.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If something happened to you, that house has got some value to it. It's going to go to someone. It doesn't mean you have to be a millionaire to have a testamentary trust. I think you just need to think about, well, who are going to be my beneficiaries? But there's a lot of stuff in there, and it's obviously a very, very complicated situation. I just spent 3 days learning it intensely. But just to try and put it into a nutshell, I think if you have got issues about or concerns about your structure, about your asset protection, about your estate, you probably should talk to someone about it and just feel a bit more assured. It may cost you a little bit to get all of the structures in place, but I really think it's worth spending.
Absolutely.
And there's all these other strategies we can do as well. So, thinking about how we how we position things, can we do sort of things to essentially make sure that everything's, sort of locked away into the place it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. And it's super important. These documents are super important. And if you haven't got a will in place or it's outdated, please go and make a will or get it updated.
Definitely.
And that includes you, Jo.
Well, I mean, I do have a will. I just think it's time to get it updated.
updated.
And it's definitely something that I have got on my radar. And now that I have the ability to do this, I will be getting it sorted out.
Very good.
And also be very careful about those enduring powers of attorney. I think they're very critical. And I think we often think, you know, it's something that we don't really think about. But anything can happen to anyone at any time. And I think it's really sort of brought home to me as well with Rod, you know, the situation he was in. You know, possibly we were pretty lucky he didn't really have he didn't have too much time where he wasn't really able to make a decision. So, but, you know, that could have gone on, and I didn't have the right paperwork in place, and I might not have been able to do that for him. So, so just get out there and get it sorted.
Exactly right. Totally.
Okay. Well, on a brighter note, okay, well, I think that's it for the show today.